where you really see an impact on modern day, what I would say, current linguistic anthropology. And the focus of linguistic anthropology since the 90s on power and language and power is when you look at the impact of language on gender, language and gender, or the discussion of language and gender. And so I'm going to run back here real quick. So coming out of the 60s and 70s, if some of you may be familiar with Robin Lakoff, and Robin Lakoff's work from the 1970s was very influential and very important. Some of you may have heard of assertiveness training for women in the workforce, and this comes out of Lakoff's work from the 70s. Lakoff didn't call this female deficit theory, but it's often referred to as female deficit theory because here's the idea. So there was a lot of research in the 50s and 60s that was done by linguists. And what they did is they sat down with normal Americans, which meant they picked white middle-class suburban couples. And they sat down with them in experimental settings and said, please talk. And when they recorded this language, they realized, wow, Americans, or they didn't say that, they said men and women speak really differently. What they didn't say was white suburban men and women in the 50s and 60s speak differently. But they said, wow, men and women speak so differently. Men are so rude and loud, and they talk over you, and they interrupt, and they're competitive. And women are just so quiet and passive, and they're cooperative, and they never say anything mean, and they're not vulgar. And the idea was, boy, this must be something in our genetics, right? Men just must be aggressive, powerful people, and women must just be, these cooperative, nurturing, passive people. And so this caused, right? This is one of these great problems of people's own construction. It caused this great problem where it was like, well, how are women going to enter the workforce? 60s and 70s corporate America, it's this hostile linguistic environment for women. And so the argument here that people like Lakoff made was that the language difference between men and women in the workforce and in the workplace is a product of natural, inherent power differences between men and women, right? Men are simply more powerful. They're the dominant sex. And therefore, right, women need assertiveness training because they're just not on that level. So if women want to compete in that sort of Mad Men atmosphere of corporate America, they need to be given training to be more assertive and to keep up. Okay, very big impact that has then in the 1970s and through the 1980s. The anthropologists start getting into it in 1982, 1984, where you see Maltz and Borker. And some of you may not be familiar with Maltz and Borker, classics from the early 80s. But what they did is they developed this dual cultures model where they critiqued Lakoff in particular and said, okay, we know from anthropology this idea that men are just naturally dominant to women, that's just wrong, right? That's just false. In fact, while it's true, you can go to any culture in the world and say, do men and women speak differently? And people will say, yeah, they do. When you ask, how do men speak or how do women speak? What they will tell you is very different, right? In some cultures, they will say, women are really loud and really vulgar. And in others, they'll say, well, men are really loud and really vulgar, right? It depends on the culture. And so for Maltz and Borker, what was interesting is they said, okay, what's going on here in the workforce is not really a power issue. The problem is we have two different cultures of language, okay? We have boy language, okay? And we have girl language. And girls grow up in these girl cultures and they play with girls and they play girl games, and then they develop a culture that's not really natural, but it's this, sort of girl language. And then they bring that to this, the classroom, they bring it to the office. And then they bump into boy culture and boy language that develops from boy games and boy things. And so in other words, what's interesting about this is it's not really actually about power for Maltz and Borker, it's about culture, gender cultures. And they actually, in their model, they draw on methods for resolving conflict between ethnic groups that speak different language. And they basically say, this is the same kind of thing we're doing. Now, this has a huge impact. The big people this impacts in the 1990s are John Gray, PhD. He always puts a PhD after his name. He wrote Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And the other is Deb Tannen. These are both kind of pseudo-academics. Deb Tannen always gets cited by anthropologists for some reason as the only person they can think of. But Deb Tannen's not really a self-help academic. And these are both self-help academics. And what they do is they take Maltz and Borker's idea and they say, aha, let's apply this to America. Where you really want to see this, go watch White Men Can't Jump. Rosie Perez's character is really into this stuff and is always trying to explain it back to Woody Harrelson in that movie. But the idea here is that women just have to understand men. And if you can understand men and men's culture, then you'll understand why men talk the way they talk. And you'll just let them go and forgive them. And men at the same time just have to realize, look, this is how women are. This is women's culture. women talk this way, and that's just the way they are, and we just have to let them, do this. And most of these self-help books, you might understand, are actually marketed to women, right, who are upset with how their husband speaks. And this is about, hey, you just have to understand that this is about culture. This is boys' culture. Okay. Now, where does this go? You can imagine that by the 1990s, many linguistic anthropologists are calling BS on a lot of this. And I'm going to point to Deborah Cameron in particular as my favorite. She has a great book called The Myth of Mars and Venus, but there are many others that you can point to who basically say, okay, look, Lakoff was absolutely right. This is about power. The problem was this was not inherent power. This isn't power that we're born with that makes men more powerful than women. However, in 1950s America, right, men had a lot more power than women, and that's why we're seeing these differences in language. However, instead of going at this as, oh, women need more assertiveness, right, maybe the problem was that men were being a little bit over the top with their empowerment, okay? At the same time, they would look at Maltz and Borker and say, okay, yeah, these are cultural issues, but you can't just start giving people self-help about this and make it seem like, oh, boys will just be boys, right? And that's one of the big takeaways here, right? There are legitimate power issues taking place here, right? And by just saying, oh, this is just a cultural difference, we're ignoring the power, okay? And so the key here with Deborah Cameron is to say, look, this is about power, but this is about culturally constructed power. And we need to look at that power. This is an inherent power. And in fact, you can find cultural examples. Some of my favorite are Don Kulik's examples from New Guinea, where you can find cultures where men are very passive and very quiet and women are extremely vulgar and extremely loud. And that's rooted in cultural ideologies about gender. And so the big takeaway that we get here from linguistic anthropology and gender and power, okay, is the kind of gendered language ideologies, the kind of ideas about gender that we find in language are a reflection of power in society.